She was not supposed to be at the royal winter banquet. She had no invitation. No title. No family name that the herald could announce with any pride. She had borrowed a gown the color of deep midnight blue from a cousin who did not know she had taken it, pinned her dark hair into a shape that suggested breeding without confirming it, and walked through the east entrance of Caervale Palace with the calm unbothered posture of someone who had every right to be there. She had done it because her younger sister was inside. Her sister, who had been summoned to perform as a court musician and who had been sending letters home for 3 weeks that grew shorter and more careful with each one, the letters of a girl who had stopped saying what she actually meant. Seraphine did not know what she was walking into. She found out within the first hour. She was standing against the far wall of the grand banquet hall watching her sister perform at the front of the room, watching the way the second-tier court nobles laughed too loudly near her, watching the way one man in particular let his gaze rest on her sister the way men rested their gaze on things they already considered theirs, when she became aware that someone was standing beside her. She did not look. She was used to ignoring men at events like this. It was a survival skill. Then he said, quietly, "You are going to break that goblet if you hold it any tighter." She looked at her hand. He was right. Her knuckles were white around the stem of her wine goblet and the metal had started to bend under her grip. She looked at him. He was tall. Dark-haired. Dressed in the plain formal coat of someone who had nothing to prove and knew it. His eyes were a deep forest green and they were not looking at her sister. They were looking at her. And then he said the 4 words that changed everything. He said, "Who hurt you?" Not as a performance. Not as a line. As a genuine question from a man who had looked at her face and seen something true. And Seraphine, who had not cried in front of anyone in 4 years, felt her throat close entirely. She did not answer. But he did not walk away. By morning, the man who had asked her that question had removed 3 nobles from court positions, sent 1 lord out of the capital by royal decree, and had the second-tier ballroom cleared and locked. And Seraphine was standing in his private study trying to understand how a single evening had burned the world she had walked into completely down. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Like, share, and comment telling us where you are watching from. Let us begin. The girl who was not invited. Caervale Palace in winter was the most beautiful trap Seraphine had ever seen. She had grown up hearing about it. Everyone in the outer provinces heard about it. The grand white stone facade, the gilded entrance gates, the banquet halls that could hold 500 people in comfort and twice that in spectacle. The winter gathering was the crown's annual display of power and abundance, and invitations were the currency of belonging in this kingdom. Her family had not been invited in 11 years. Once, they had been. Once, the Vale name had been respectable enough to sit in the 4th row of the winter banquet hall, close enough to see the royal table, far enough that no one with real power had to speak to them. Her father had worn the best coat he owned and her mother had spent 2 weeks on her hair arrangement, and Seraphine, 7 years old and wide-eyed, had thought it was the grandest thing in the world. Then her father had died, and the debts he had hidden from everyone had surfaced like stones from a drained lake, and the Vale family had retreated to the outer edge of respectability and stayed there. Her mother had managed. Her younger sister Lyra had inherited their mother's gift for music and had cultivated it with the discipline of someone who understood it was their way forward. At 19, Lyra had auditioned for a position in the court musician rotation, a traveling program that placed talented young performers in noble houses for 6-month engagements at a time. She had been accepted. Their mother had wept with pride. The first 2 months of letters from Lyra had been warm and detailed, full of descriptions of the palace rooms and the food and the other musicians and the wonderful strange world she was now part of. The 3rd month's letters began to shorten. The 4th month brought 2 letters instead of the usual weekly ones, and they were careful in a way that made Seraphine's stomach tighten when she read them. The last letter, which had arrived 10 days ago, was 3 sentences long. I am well. The engagement continues until spring. Do not worry. Do not worry was the thing people wrote when they wanted you to worry but could not say so directly. Seraphine had spent 10 days making arrangements. She had borrowed the midnight blue gown, altered it in 2 places for better fit, pinned her dark brown hair into the kind of structured arrangement that read as aristocratic from a distance and merely careful up close, and had come to the winter banquet the only way she could. Without an invitation. The east entrance was used by the court staff and lower service personnel during large events. It was also used by musicians, who were considered elegant enough for the main hall but not quite important enough for the front door. She had walked through it behind a group of lute players with the confidence of someone who had simply arrived separately, and not a single person had stopped her. She had found Lyra in the first half hour. Her sister was stationed at the far end of the main banquet hall with 3 other musicians, all of them in the formal white and gold ensemble required for court performance. Lyra was playing beautifully. She always played beautifully. But she was not looking at her instrument or at the music sheets or at the other musicians. She was tracking the room. Watching certain people. Avoiding certain gazes. Her body had the coiled careful posture of an animal that has learned to be very alert in a particular environment. Seraphine stood against the far wall and watched her sister and watched the people watching her sister, and she held her wine goblet and she understood with cold clarity what 4 months of shortened letters had been trying not to say. The man was Lord Crescent. She identified him within 20 minutes of watching. 42 years old. Court noble of the 2nd rank. He had the easy physical comfort of a man who had never once worried about whether his presence was welcome in a room. He laughed with the other nobles near the music platform. He let his gaze slide over the musicians the way a merchant looks over goods. When it landed on Lyra, it stayed. Seraphine's hand tightened on her goblet. She did not notice it doing so. She did not notice the man who came to stand beside her either, not until he spoke. He said, "You are going to break that goblet if you hold it any tighter." She looked at her hand first. Her knuckles were white. The thin metal stem had bent slightly under her grip. She looked at him. He was taller than she had registered from the corner of her vision, broad through the shoulder in the way of someone who had used his body for more than walking palace corridors. His coat was plain dark green, high-collared, with silver buttons and no decorative insignia, which was itself a statement at an event where everyone else was wearing their house colors and family crests. His hair was dark brown, worn slightly long at the crown and shorter at the sides, and he had the kind of jaw that looked like it had been sculpted with a specific intention. His eyes, when she met them, were a deep forest green, and they were entirely focused on her face. Not on the room. Not on the musicians. On her. She said, "I am fine." It was an obvious deflection and he did not pretend otherwise. He simply waited, the way someone waits who is not in any particular hurry and does not believe the first answer they have been given. She looked back at the music platform. He did not leave. After a moment he said, "The musician with the dark hair. The one in the center. You know her." It was not a question. He had read the connection from her posture. She said, "My sister." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long has she been part of the court musician program?" 4 months. Another pause. Then, very quietly, he said those 4 words. "Who hurt you?" She turned to look at him fully because no one had ever asked her that. Not like that. Not with that particular quality of directness that had no performance in it, no social calculation, just a man who had looked at her face and decided she deserved to have someone say the true thing. She found that she could not answer. Not because she did not know. Because the knowing had been sitting in her chest for 10 days and she had been alone with it, and being asked directly was different from carrying it alone. Her throat closed. He looked at her for one steady moment. Then he looked at the room. He looked at Lord Cresson. Something crossed his face that was very quiet and very cold. He said, "Stay here." He walked away. She stayed. She did not know why. She did not know who he was. She did not know what he intended to do. She stayed because something in his voice had carried the absolute certainty of a man who did not say things he did not mean, and because she had nowhere else to go, and because her legs felt strange. She watched him cross the banquet hall. He did not approach Lord Cresson. He approached the 2 men standing to Cresson's left, the ones she had noticed earlier because they occupied the particular social orbit of people who orbited someone more powerful. He spoke to them briefly. Quietly. Whatever he said did not take long. Both men went pale. They left the hall within 5 minutes. He crossed to the head steward next, a conversation that lasted even less time. The steward nodded twice and moved away. Within 10 minutes, the cluster of nobles near the music platform had dispersed in different directions, the way people disperse when someone above them in the hierarchy has indicated, very quietly, that their presence in a specific location is no longer welcome. Lord Cresson looked around, confused, and then looked toward the man in the dark green coat. Whatever he saw in the Duke's face made him take one step back. He left the hall. The man in the dark green coat came back to the wall where she was standing. He said, "She will not be approached tonight." Seraphine stared at him. She said, "Who are you?" He said, "Duke Aldrich Kervane. This is my family's palace." She stared at him for a longer moment. She said, "I do not have an invitation." He said, "I know. I checked." A pause. He said, "You still have not answered my question." She looked at her sister, who was playing again, her posture slightly easier now, the room around her reorganized into something less threatening. She said, "I do not know where to start." He said, "Start anywhere." "I am not going anywhere." And so, against every practical instinct she had developed in 26 years of being a woman who managed things alone, she started. "What 4 words can cost?" She told him about the letters. Not all of it at once. She was not built for that kind of open-handed surrender of information. She told him in pieces, the way she did everything, checking his face between each piece to see what he did with it. He did not interrupt. He did not express sympathy in the way that people expressed sympathy when they were really just waiting to speak. He simply listened, and she understood from the quality of his attention that he was building a picture from what she gave him, the same way she had been building one herself for 10 days. She told him the letters had shortened. She told him about the 3-sentence letter. She told him she had counted the days between each one and noted the pattern of what stopped being mentioned. The descriptions of the other musicians. The mention of meals and rooms and small pleasures. All of it stripped away until only the bare minimum remained, the letters of a girl saying "I am alive" without being able to say anything more. When she finished, the Duke was looking at the space in front of him with his arms crossed and his jaw set. He said, "How old is she?" 19. A brief silence. He said, "The court musician program operates under the Palace Cultural Office. I sit on its oversight committee, which I have not used in 8 months because I have been away managing the Northern Estate situation." That was a mistake. She looked at him. She said, "You are not responsible for what other people do." He said, "I am responsible for what happens inside systems I am supposed to oversee." There was no self-pity in it. Just the flat accountability of a man who held himself to a precise standard. She found she did not know what to do with that either. He said, "Lord Crescent has a pattern. This is not the first complaint that has been managed quietly instead of properly. The Cultural Office has been accepting payments from second-tier nobles to permit extended access to the musicians in the program. I heard one reference to it 6 months ago and did not follow it up because I was occupied elsewhere. I should have." Seraphine said, "You are telling me this has been happening to other girls?" He met her eyes. "Yes." Her hand tightened on the wine goblet again. He reached over and removed it from her hand. He set it on the tray of a passing server without looking away from her face. He said, "I am going to fix it. All of it. Tonight I can only clear the room. Tomorrow I can do more." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because it is wrong and I have the authority to correct it." She said, "That is not why you are still standing here talking to me." A very brief pause. The corner of his mouth moved. He said, "No. It is not entirely why." The banquet continued around them for another 2 hours. Seraphine spent those 2 hours standing beside the Duke of Kervane, which was an experience she had no frame for. People noticed him the way people notice weather, instinctively, physically, adjusting their behavior to account for his presence without always being aware they were doing it. Court nobles who passed near their section of wall found reasons to move slightly away. The head steward checked on their corner 3 times. 2 women of obvious rank sent glances in his direction that had layers of calculation in them that Seraphine, who was not stupid, could read easily. He noticed none of it. Or he noticed all of it and did not care. She suspected the latter. He asked her questions. Not about the situation with Lyra, which he seemed to have filed away in a separate mental category labeled things to be handled tomorrow. About other things. What she did, which she answered plainly as managing the family accounts and the small property her mother had kept from her father's estate, work she had taken on at 22 when it became clear no one else was going to do it. What she had wanted to do, which was a question she was not used to being asked and which took her a moment to answer. She had wanted to study law. He looked at her with genuine interest and said, "Why law?" She said, "Because most of the problems I grew up watching happen to people I loved were caused by laws that were poorly written or selectively enforced, and I thought it would be useful to understand them precisely." He said, "Did you?" She said, "Enough to be dangerous in a negotiation. Not enough to do anything formal." He said, "That is a waste." She said, "It is the situation I was given." He said, "Situations can change." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the banquet hall with the particular expression of a man who has just decided something. She said, "Do not do that." He said, "Do what?" She said, "Make decisions about my life in the background of your thinking without saying them out loud. I can see you doing it." He turned to look at her. The forest green eyes held something that was the beginning of what she would later recognize as the particular expression he got when she surprised him. He said, "I was thinking that the Palace Cultural Oversight Committee needs a legal advisor who understands selective enforcement. I was thinking it before I remembered that making that observation would be presumptuous given that I met you 2 hours ago." She said, "It is presumptuous." He said, "Yes. I know." A pause. She said, "It is also interesting." He said nothing. But the corner of his mouth moved again. At midnight, as the banquet moved into its final hour, the Duke excused himself briefly. He returned 12 minutes later and stood beside her and said, "I have sent word to 3 members of the Palace Administrative Council. Lord Crescent will receive a formal notification of a conduct review tomorrow morning. The 2 men who were with him tonight have been informed their court access is suspended pending investigation. The head of the cultural office has been asked to report to my private office at 8 in the morning. Seraphine stared at him. She said, "You did all of that in 12 minutes. He said, "I have a very efficient personal secretary." She said, "And you can do all of that?" Conduct reviews. Access suspensions. He said, "I hold the second highest administrative rank in this court. I can do quite a lot. I do not typically do it at midnight at a winter banquet, but the circumstances are not typical." She felt something shift in the center of her chest. She was not entirely sure what it was. Something that had been clenched very tight for 10 days was beginning, cautiously, to release. She said, "My sister does not know I am here." He said, "I know. I am going to have someone from the palace guard escort her to the musician quarters safely when the performance ends. Tonight. And tomorrow, if you are willing to come to my office, we can discuss what the investigation will look like and how to ensure she is moved out of the rotation immediately." She said, "You have known me for 2 hours." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why are you doing this?" He said, "I told you. Because it is wrong and I have the authority." She said, "That is still not the whole answer." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Because when I came to stand beside you tonight I saw a woman holding herself together through sheer force of will for someone she loves, and that is a thing I understand. And because you looked at me and I asked you a question and instead of giving me a court answer you went silent, which is what honest people do when they are asked something true. And I find that I do not want to walk away from an honest person." The banquet hall hummed around them, 500 people in their finest royal dress, candles burning in every chandelier, the music drifting from the platform where Lyra still played. Seraphine said, quietly, "Thank you." He said, "You have not answered my question yet." She said, "I know." He waited. She said, "My father died owing debts to people who took everything that could be taken. My mother spent 6 years being managed and pitted by people who had been her equals. My sister has spent 4 months learning that talent does not protect you from people who have decided you belong to them. And I have spent 10 days being frightened out of my mind and completely alone with it because there was no one to tell who could actually do anything." She paused. She said, "That is who hurt me. All of that. All of them. Years of it." He was very still. Then he said, quietly and precisely, "That will not continue." She believed him. She could not have said why. She simply did. Mourning and what it asks. She did not go home. She had planned to. She had planned to see that Lyra was safely escorted, to satisfy herself that the room had changed enough for one night, and to leave the way she came, through the east entrance, back into the city, back to her mother's house, back to the world she had spent 11 years learning to navigate. Instead, at 1 in the morning, she was sitting in a small antechamber off the main corridor of the East Wing with a cup of tea she had not asked for and the Duke's personal secretary, a compact woman of 50 with silver-streaked hair and an expression of practiced neutrality, sitting across from her explaining the logistics of a palace guest room. Apparently, the Duke had arranged one. She said, "I did not ask for a room." The secretary said, "His Grace anticipated that you might say that. He asked me to point out that it is 1 in the morning, the city transport is not running until 5, and the morning meeting at his office begins at 8, which would require you to leave your home at 6:30 to arrive in time, which is logistically inferior to simply having a room here." Seraphine looked at the secretary. She said, "He anticipated all of that." The secretary said, "His Grace is very thorough." She said, "I do not have a change of clothes." The secretary produced a small folded packet. She said, "His Grace asked the Palace Linen Office to provide a morning dress from the guest wardrobe. Your measurements were estimated. Adjustments can be made." Seraphine opened her mouth. She closed it. She said, "He estimated my measurements." The secretary said, quite professionally, "He is very observant, my lady." Seraphine sat with that for a moment. Then she took the packet and said, "Thank you." The guest room was in the east wing, 3 doors down from a room she would later learn was used by visiting minor nobility. It was not grand. It was tasteful and quiet, with pale gray walls and a wide window that looked over the winter garden, bare-branched trees and frozen fountain basins, everything still and silver in the early morning darkness. She sat on the edge of the bed in her borrowed midnight blue gown and looked at the window for a long time. She thought about Lyra, who the palace guard had escorted to the musician quarters an hour ago. She had watched from a distance, far enough not to be noticed, close enough to see that her sister walked with her head up and her shoulders down, the posture of someone who had been released from a pressure they had been holding against for a long time. She thought about the Duke, who had said good-night to her in the corridor with the same precise contained manner he had used for everything else, no flourish, no performance, just a direct look and "I will see you at 8" and then he had walked away. She thought about "Who hurt you?" 4 words. She had carried the weight of a decade on her chest for so long she had stopped noticing it as a weight. She had simply thought of it as the shape of her life. Then someone had named it, directly and without flinching, and the naming had done something she had not expected. It had made the weight visible. Which made it possible, for the first time, to think about setting it down. She lay down on the palace bed in her borrowed blue gown and pulled the heavy wool blanket over herself and did not sleep for a long time. When she did sleep, she did not dream about debt or shortened letters or the way her mother looked when she thought no one was watching her. She dreamed about a winter garden going green. The morning dress fit almost precisely. The waist was 1 inch too large, which she fixed with a pin from her hair arrangement. It was a deep rose color, high-collared, with long fitted sleeves and a full royal skirt that moved quietly when she walked. It was the kind of dress she had not owned in years. She met Lyra in the corridor outside the musician quarters at 7. Her sister saw her first and stopped walking entirely. Then Lyra crossed the corridor in 4 fast steps and pulled her into her arms, and they stood there in the east wing corridor of Kervale Palace holding on to each other without speaking for a long moment. When Lyra pulled back, her eyes were bright and her voice was steady with the effort of keeping it that way. She said, "How did you know?" Seraphine said, "Your letters." Lyra said, "I tried to be careful." Seraphine said, "You were. But I know how you write when you are happy and I know how you write when you are managing," and the last letter was 3 sentences. Lyra looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "There is a duke." Seraphine said, "I know." Lyra said, "He had Lord Crescent escorted out of the banquet hall last night by the head of the palace guard." Seraphine said, "I know." Lyra looked at her with the expression of a younger sister who has just assembled information she is deciding what to do with. She said, "You were there last night. You were not invited." Seraphine said, "I was not." Lyra said, "And the Duke?" Seraphine said, "He is thorough." Lyra looked at her for another moment. Then she said, "Sarah." Seraphine said, "Go have breakfast. I have a meeting at 8. The Duke's private office was not what she expected. She had expected something designed to impress. High ceilings, heavy furniture, the accumulated evidence of power arranged deliberately for the benefit of people who came to be reminded of it. It was a working room. Large but functional. Shelves of documents organized by year and category. A broad desk covered in reports and correspondence. 2 good chairs facing the desk and one behind it. Windows overlooking the palace formal garden. No portraits of ancestors. No ceremonial weapons on the walls. One painting, small, of a coastal landscape in gray and green, hung where he could see it from his desk. He was standing when she arrived, by the window, in his plain dark formal attire, dark coat over white, no ornamentation except the small house seal ring on his right hand. He turned when she entered. He looked at the dress for exactly 1 second and then looked at her face. He said, "The fit is acceptable." She said, "1 pin at the waist." He said, "I will have the measurements corrected." She said, "You do not need to have measurements corrected for 1 meeting." He said, "It is not for 1 meeting." She looked at him. He indicated the chair. He said, "Please sit." The head of the cultural office arrives in 10 minutes. I want to explain what I intend to propose before he gets here. She sat. She folded her hands in her lap. She felt the pin at her waist pressing slightly and was grateful for the small concrete reality of it. He said, "I am dissolving the current musician program structure entirely and rebuilding it under direct palace oversight with a formal code of conduct and an independent review process. Lord Crescent will face a formal removal hearing before the Court Administrative Council. The 2 associates from last night are already gone. The head of the cultural office has been informed that his continued position depends on full cooperation with the investigation." He paused. He said, "Your sister will be offered a formal court musician position under the new structure if she wishes it. Permanent. Under proper contract. With a salary commensurate with her skill." Seraphine said, what does that require from her? He said, her continued talent, which is evident. And her willingness to stay. She said, she will want to think about it. He said, of course. A pause. She said, and what does this require from me? He looked at her steadily. He said, nothing. Everything I just described will happen regardless. Your sister's situation will be addressed regardless. You did not need to come this morning. I told you 8 o'clock because I wanted you to be informed of what was happening and because I thought you deserved to hear it directly. She said, that is the only reason. He said, no. She waited. He said, I told you last night that I find honest people difficult to walk away from. That remains true this morning. I wanted to see you again. That is the other reason. The morning light came through the windows and fell across the desk between them, and outside the formal garden was bare and winter gray and the room was very quiet. She said, I came because I wanted to be informed. And because I wanted to see you again. That is also true. He held her gaze for a moment. He said, good. The door knocked. The head of the cultural office had arrived. She straightened in her chair and looked at the door and then looked back at the Duke and said, do you want me to stay for this meeting? He said, very simply, yes. She said, then I will stay. He went to open the door. Like and subscribe and leave a comment. This story is for everyone who has ever needed someone to stay. The weight of being seen. The meeting with the head of the cultural office lasted 90 minutes. The man's name was Director Holst. He was 60 years old, had held his position for 14 years, and had the manner of someone who had learned to be indispensable to multiple people with competing interests simultaneously. He was not corrupt in the obvious way. He was corrupt in the quieter way, the way of someone who had made small accommodations to power for so long that he had lost the ability to see them as accommodations rather than simply how things worked. He had not expected Seraphine to be in the room. He said, with professional courtesy, I was not aware there would be an additional attendee. The Duke said, Miss Vale is advising on the review process. Please proceed. Holst looked at her with the particular assessing gaze of a man recalibrating his approach. She returned it pleasantly and took out the small notebook she had asked the secretary for. She had spent 40 minutes that morning reviewing the 3 documents the Duke had laid on the desk for her before Holst arrived. The musician program charter. The cultural office operating procedures. And the payment record, which the Duke had obtained from the Palace Financial Office and which was considerably more detailed than anyone had apparently intended it to be. She had made notes. The 90 minutes proceeded with the particular rhythm of a conversation between a man who wanted to manage a situation and 2 people who had decided not to let him. Holst offered explanations. The Duke asked precise questions. Seraphine asked the questions that came from the documents, the ones about specific dates and specific amounts and the names of the nobles whose access requests had been approved without the formal committee review the charter required. By the 45th minute Holst had stopped trying to manage anything and was simply answering. By the 65th minute he had given them 3 additional names they had not previously had. By the end of the 90 minutes, the Duke had a full picture and Holst had understood that his continued tenure depended on his cooperation with everything that followed. When he left, the Duke closed the office door and turned to look at her. He said, "Where did you learn to do that?" She was still writing in her notebook. She said, "I watched my mother negotiate with creditors for 6 years. The principle is the same. You let them talk until they have given you what you need, and you ask about the documents, not the explanations, because documents do not change their story." He sat on the edge of his desk and watched her finish her notes. He said, "You said you wanted to study law." She said, "I said I did not get far enough for it to be formal." He said, "The Palace Administrative Council has a legal review division. It is currently understaffed and headed by a man who is thorough but slow. A second advisor who is fast and thorough would be a significant asset." She looked up from her notebook. She said, "You are doing it again." He said, "I told you I was going to." She said, "I came to Caervale Palace without an invitation 2 days ago to find my sister." He said, "Yes." She said, "I do not have a formal legal qualification." He said, "You have practical knowledge, a demonstrable aptitude, and a specific kind of intelligence that qualifications do not always produce. The position comes with a formal training program. 6 months to certification." She was quiet. He said, "I am not asking you to decide now. I am asking you to consider it." She said, "What if I consider it and say no?" He said, "Then you will say no and I will have to find someone less capable for the position." A pause. She said, "That is manipulative." He said, "It is accurate." She looked at him. He was looking at her with that particular quality of attention that she had spent 2 days learning to read. The attention of a man who was interested in all of her, not just the parts that were useful to him. She said, "Why do you keep looking at me like that?" He said, "Like what?" She said, "Like I am the most interesting thing in the room." He said, "You are." She said, "There is an entire palace." He said, "Yes. And you are still the most interesting thing in it." She looked away. She looked at the small coastal painting on his wall. She thought about her mother. About Lyra. About the weight she had been carrying alone for 10 days and the 4 words that had, somehow, made it possible to put it down. She said, "I need to speak to my mother before I decide anything." He said, "Of course." She said, "And Lyra needs time to make her own decision about the position." He said, "Yes." She said, "And I need you to understand that if I take the position it is because I want it. Not because you arranged it for me. Not because I feel an obligation. Because I want it." He said, "I understand that completely." She looked at him. She said, "And the other thing. Whatever this is." Whatever is happening between us in this room. That is a separate question and it has a separate answer and neither answer affects the other. He said, I agree entirely. She said, you agree very easily. He said, I agree because you are right. The positions are separate. I would not want you in the role because of anything personal between us, and I would not want anything personal between us contingent on the role. Both things should stand on their own terms. She said, that is a very reasonable position for a duke. He said, I am, on occasion, reasonable. The winter morning light had moved across the office floor and was now coming through the window at the angle that meant late morning. Somewhere in the palace, Lyra was having breakfast and thinking about her future. Somewhere in the city, Seraphine's mother was at home not knowing any of this had happened. She said, I need to go home today. He said, the palace carriage is available whenever you are ready. She said, you do not need to send a carriage. He said, I know. I want to. She looked at him one more time. The plain dark coat. The forest green eyes. The man who had stood beside a wall at a winter banquet and asked the true question. She said, I will send word when I have spoken to my mother. He said, I will be here. What grows in winter? She was gone for 12 days. She had not planned for 12 days. She had planned for perhaps 3. Enough time to explain everything to her mother, to sit with Lyra's decision, to let the shaking in her chest settle down to something manageable. It took longer than 3 days because her mother cried, which she had not expected. Not from fear. From something that Seraphine eventually recognized as relief, the specific exhausted relief of someone who has been braced for impact for so long that when the blow does not come they do not know immediately what to do with themselves. Her mother sat at the kitchen table and listened to everything, all of it, the banquet and the Duke and the 4 words and the morning meeting and Lord Crescent and Lyra's new position. And when Seraphine finished her mother folded her hands on the table and cried quietly for about 5 minutes. Then she said, I have been so frightened. Seraphine said, I know. Her mother said, I have been frightened since your father died and I have not known how to stop. Seraphine said, I know, Mama. Her mother wiped her face with the back of her hand and said, Tell me about him. She told her. Her mother listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When she finished her mother said, He sounds like a serious man. Seraphine said, He is. Her mother said, Serious men are either very good or very difficult. Seraphine said, He is both, I think. Her mother considered this. Then she said, That is honest. I appreciate that you did not tell me he was perfect. Seraphine said, He is not perfect. He admitted he should have addressed the cultural office situation 6 months ago and did not. He holds himself accountable for that in a way that is uncomfortable to watch because it is genuine. Her mother said, Does he make you feel safe? Seraphine looked at the kitchen table. She said, He makes me feel like I do not have to manage everything alone. I am not entirely sure what to do with that yet. Her mother said, "You can start by letting it be." Lyra came home on the 5th day, transported by palace carriage, which caused a brief sensation in the street outside their mother's house. She was carrying 2 new cases of sheet music and had a color in her face that had been absent from the letters for months. She had accepted the permanent position. She said, "I have conditions." Seraphine said, "Tell me." Lyra said, "I am lead musician in my ensemble. I approve my own performance schedule. I have a written contract with termination protections. And I want a formal induction ceremony because I have earned it." Seraphine said, "I will put it in writing and send it to the Duke's office." Lyra said, "You are going to take the position." It was not a question. Seraphine said, "I am considering it." Lyra said, "Sarah, you have been considering things your whole life to make sure everyone else was all right first. Consider something for yourself." Seraphine looked at her sister. 19 years old and playing the finest venues in the kingdom on her own terms. Their mother's daughter entirely. She said, "I am." She sent word on the 10th day. The note said, "I have spoken to my mother. My sister has accepted the permanent position and has conditions she will send through my office when I have one. I will arrive Thursday morning if the offer still stands." His reply came the same evening. It said, "The offer stands. Thursday morning. I will be in my office." And then below that, in the same precise hand, a single additional line. It said, "I am glad you are coming back." She folded the note and put it in the small box where she kept the things she wanted to keep. Thursday morning was clear and very cold. She arrived at Kervale Palace through the front gate this time, in the palace carriage, with her case, and was met by the secretary who had appeared with tea and a guest room packet 2 weeks ago. The secretary showed her to an office in the administrative wing, larger than she had expected, with windows overlooking the formal garden and shelves that were currently empty. Her shelves. The secretary left. She stood in the empty office and looked at the garden. The formal garden in winter was a study in structure and patience, all clipped hedges and frozen pathways and bare rose arbors, everything waiting for the season to turn. She heard footsteps she recognized in the corridor. He knocked on the open door. She turned. He was in the plain dark coat and looked exactly as she remembered him, which was something she had been telling herself she had probably exaggerated in her memory, and had not. He looked at the empty shelves. He said, "The legal review documents for the current quarter are in the East Archive. I can have them brought up this morning." She said, "That would be useful." He said, "The formal training program begins next Monday. It runs for 6 months and involves 3 sessions a week with the senior legal counsel." She said, "I will be there." He said, "Your sister's conditions arrived yesterday. They are reasonable and I have accepted all of them." She said, "Good." A pause. He said, "How is your mother?" She said, "She is better. She cried when I told her. The good kind." He said, I am glad. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the same quality of attention she had spent 12 days thinking about, the attention that made her feel like all of her was visible and none of it was a problem. She said, "You sent a very direct reply to my note." He said, "I told you I was going to be direct." She said, "You said you were glad I was coming back." He said, "I was." She said, "That was not a professional observation." He said, "No. It was not." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I thought about what you said. About the two things being separate. The position and the other thing." He said, "Yes." She said, "I think you were right that they should be separate. And I think I am here for both of them." He looked at her steadily. He said, "Both." She said, "Both." He moved from the doorway into the room. He crossed to the window where she was standing and stood beside her, the way he had stood beside her at the wall of the winter banquet, close enough for the closeness to be a choice and far enough for it still to be a question. He said, "I want to do this correctly. Whatever this becomes." She said, "What does correctly look like for you?" He said, slowly. Honestly. With no assumptions about what you want without asking you first. With the understanding that you have been managing everything alone for a long time and that I am not adding to your list of things to manage. She looked at him. She said, "That is a very precise definition." He said, "I thought about it for 12 days. Something in her chest expanded in a way that was warm and slightly terrifying and entirely welcome. She said, "I thought about it too." She said, "I thought about how you stood beside me for 2 hours at a banquet without being invited to and asked me the thing no one asks and did not need me to answer it to stay." He was very still. She said, "I am not very practiced at being taken care of. I have been the one doing the taking care of for a long time. I may not always know how to receive it gracefully." He said, "I am not very practiced at offering it. I may not always know how to offer it without it looking like logistics." She said, "You sent a palace carriage to my mother's house. That looked like logistics." He said, "It was also care." She said, "I know. I could tell the difference." He reached out and she did not move away and he took her hand the way someone takes something they have been careful with from the beginning. He said, "Then we will learn. Both of us. At the pace that is right." Outside the window, the winter garden was very still. The bare rose arbors stood in their careful structure, waiting. She looked at their hands and then at his face and then out at the garden. She said, "In spring the formal garden will be different." He said, "Yes. Considerably." She said, "I would like to see it." He said, "You will be here in spring." It was not a question. She said, "Yes." She would. She was already home. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story touched something in you, subscribe, leave a comment about your favorite moment, like the video, and share it with someone who deserves a beautiful story today. More stories are coming. I will see you in the next one.